I first encountered George MacDonald when I was living in Tokyo. In the 1980s, a man named Michael Phillips, his story of how he rediscovered George MacDonald is quite a story in itself. But he and his wife started publishing abridged versions that take out the sermons and the Scottish dialect to make them more accessible to modern readers. So I bought every one of them that came out and enjoyed reading them. When I was living in Japan, all my work was in Japanese. And I used to read Dickens for relaxation. And then I discovered MacDonald, and he really outweighed. It's Dickens with a spiritual dimension. And just phenomenal writer, prodigious writer. So this is one of them. And then when I came back to the States, I started looking for the originals. So I bought this one and got to read this book in the original. And I will give you this bit of information right now. We visited Scotland in 2019, and we added a few days to our tour so we could visit George MacDonald's birthplace, Huntly in Aberdeen. And I joined the George MacDonald group in Facebook. And so I was corresponding with people there, and I wanted to know if anybody could give us a tour while we were there. Well, I got a note back from this lady who said she could. And then she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, our son's starting school that week. I can't do it, but we'd love to have coffee with you." So we went to, where was it? A town on the way to Huntly, and met them for coffee. And would you believe, her husband is a guy named David Jack, who actually was born and raised in Huntly, knows the dialect of that area very well. We had a wonderful conversation with them, and I had no idea I was meeting this guy who posts on the George MacDonald Facebook group often. And he has taken on himself the project of making MacDonald's Scottish dialect accessible by publishing books with double column, the Scottish, Doric, and the English, so that you can have the original if you want to get the flavor of it, but also the English translation. And he's starting, there are 12 or 13 Scottish novels. There, as far as I know, there are 4 or 5 of them out now. They're available on Amazon. So these 3 books are all the same story in different forms. So when I read George MacDonald's biography, George MacDonald and his wife, written by his oldest son, Greville, I discovered that they had come to the United States in 1872 and 1873. Greville came along. And they came to Ann Arbor. And in the book, it says, let me read. Where are we? Oh, shoot. Page 2, ungrabbed. And I'm sorry. I've got all, here we go. Nope. There, it's on the back page of the bottom page. Okay. So, an incident more notable than even Chicago and Niagara was the visit to the little university town of Ann Arbor. Its country around still glorious with fruit blossoms, its city wonderful in the splendor of its residences and gardens, considering the small population, then barely 10,000. We were entertained by the Reverend Fisk, son-in-law of old Mrs. Spence, who was first cousin of my grandfather McDonald. I need to look her up and see if there's anything in the Ann Arbor record about her. And mother of our Spence relatives in Cincinnati. It was delightful to see her and my father talking over old times and places together. She told him many things about his family he had not known. Perhaps this touch with his boyhood and the rememorizing of his father's love had something to do with his preaching there, for my mother writes of its extraordinary eloquence and how nearly all the churches were closed so that the ministers and people might come to hear him. Okay, so this is from a letter from Louisa, the mother, to her daughter. After the service on Sunday night, Father has been preaching so divinely, so simply, so powerfully, and all the other places in town, except the Episcopalians, shut their churches so that the ministers and their congregations might have the opportunity of hearing him. If ever, dear, he was truly eloquent, it was tonight. I hung on every word as an utterance from the voice of the Father speaking through him. The effect was tremendous. The listening was silence itself. So this is and then there continues a quote in her letter about Reverend Duffield, who was the pastor of the church at that time. Well, when I read that he came to Ann Arbor, I thought, okay, what church did he go to? That they closed all the other churches. So on the George McDonald website or Facebook, I wrote the question, does anybody know? And this woman named Barbara Amell, who publishes a quarterly called Wingfold. Wingfold is the title of one of MacDonald's novels about an English clergyman who became a clergyman because he was the third son. And he gets challenged by an atheist in the congregation who's there because he's dating a lady who says, you don't believe anything you say. And he goes home and he thinks about it. Do I? And it's the story of his spiritual journey. Great. So she chose that as the title. So she sent a note back and she said, oh yes, I know exactly where he preached. He preached in Ann Arbor. So I corresponded with her, and she said she tried to get information from the people here, the Summers, who were doing history. Nobody knew anything about it. I went to the Bentley Library, nothing. There was a little bit in the Detroit Free Press about McDonald's lectures here, and nothing about it. But she said, I did write about it in 2011 in her edition. So I actually bought quite a few of them that tell that story and also give a summary of his sermon on that day by Reverend Duffield, who was the pastor. Of course, it was First Presbyterian Church, right? And yeah, sorry, I missed the punchline. First Presbyterian Church in Ann Arbor. And so he wrote a summary of the sermon and published it in a little pamphlet or booklet that was being printed for preachers at that time. She got a hold of that and reprinted it in this. I have copies available if you're interested. These are actually pirated copies I made upstairs before I had this book to hand out, but if you're interested, I can make them available. So George MacDonald came here and preached. So why is that a big deal? He actually published 53 books in his lifetime. He was not Reverend George MacDonald, although he was ordained. He was defrocked. The Presbyterians evicted him from the church because they said he preached universalism. He did not preach universalism. He loved Jesus Christ. But he did not hold to some of the more harsh and severe tenets of Calvinism, which was characteristic of the Presbyterian Church in his time. He grew up in Huntley. His grandmother was a very, very rigid Calvinist. And there's some great stories about her. If you want to read about what it was like growing up in that context, Robert Falconer is the most biographical novel of George MacDonald, which really gives insights into his life. When Rawl and I visited Scotland, we went to Huntley. Well, the lady couldn't give us a tour, but she connected us with an 84-year-old retired math teacher who was a rabid George MacDonald fan. And he took us around Huntley. And showed us all the places that are in the novels that he's written. And he actually, this is a picture of him and us in Huntley. And we stood outside George MacDonald's grandmother's home. And the grandmother in this novel is very, very rigid and strict. So he pulls out this novel and he read to us the section. It's too quiet, you can't hear it, but he read the section in the novel that is depicted in the novel where the little boy is standing outside the grandmother's door and looking down the street. He'd skipped church that Sunday. And he pulled it right out and read it right there. That was just a very, very precious moment. But one of the things that MacDonald does incredibly well is to create characters with good characters. But this grandmother in this book, you think, oh, what a mean lady. I mean, I don't want to give away the punchline. I won't tell you the horrible thing that she did to bruise this young child's heart. And it actually led him away from the church and faith for a while. But he ultimately makes her lovable in a very special way. Being able to see the depth of her heart in spite of all this crusty Calvinism. MacDonald has an amazing ability to create characters who aren't pure good or pure evil, but really have these marvelous qualities.
I'll just make one comment, that what you're saying about what he did with characters shows up in The Princess and the Goblin, where the grandmother is this wonderful person
Yes.
who makes things go. So he was very effective in changing that whole narrative.
Yes, yeah. Several of the authors who write about MacDonald comment on how he was able to create good characters. Most novelists make great evil characters. But MacDonald was able to create good characters who were not phony or preachy, but really authentic. People who had gone through troubled times in life and knew how to empathize with people who were different and struggling. One of his books I didn't bring with me, Paul Faber, Surgeon, is actually a story, continuing story of the Wingfold book. But he's an atheist. He's a doctor. And it's a fascinating, the plots in these stories are really great too, the novels. I mean, the stories are very compelling. There's a murder scene in the Wingfold book. There's actually in Paul Faber, Surgeon, he has these wonderful conversations between Wingfold, who's now a believing pastor, and Faber, who's an atheist. And yet they're full of depth and understanding and insight. He didn't believe that you should ever push things on people, but it didn't mean you shouldn't challenge them. So in one of his books, he's got these two kids who are talking about, one is a real deeply religious Christian, and the other one doesn't believe in anything and doesn't believe in God. And she challenges him, you don't believe in God? He says, no, I don't believe any of it. Well, have you gone through all the universe to search to see if there is a God? And you prove that there isn't? I mean, just little questions like that, they can just kind of draw you in. So why did George MacDonald come to the United States? In Britain, in Scotland, he already had a tremendous following, and his books were being published in the United States, most of them pirated. He almost never got royalties from them. But they were read all over the country, and people loved him. They couldn't wait to get the next novel. It's interesting that he was forgotten. he was as prolific and well-loved, or more well-loved than Dickens in his time.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple reasons. One, he has a spiritual dimension, a very clear Christian dimension that some people don't want to be bothered with. And there are, I hope I can find the quote of, Lewis criticized him for being an intrusive author because he would sometimes insert himself in the narrative. But then Lewis goes on to say, and we loved him for it. And I find that when I read MacDonald, you get to a preachy part, but he makes me think about so many things. And one of the things about reading MacDonald, he always makes me want to be good. Not because you got to do that, but because you want to respond in love to a God. And the reason he got defrocked was he refused to preach hellfire and damnation. He preached about the love of God, the fatherhood of God. I know a lot of people have trouble thinking of God as father because they had bad fathers. Well, if you want to learn what a good father is like, read MacDonald. He's got some wonderful fathers. And George MacDonald's father himself was actually a wonderful father. They had a great relationship. But the fatherhood of God, the love of God. And he said, people say that hell has the last word. He firmly believed that God's love was more powerful than hell. And some people compare what he believed to purgatory, but for him it was not purgatory. It was continuing of God's refining, wanting to draw people into the love of God. So C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Great Divorce. Maybe you've read it. And in this book, in chapter 9, I think it is, the person who meets the ghost that gets off the bus from hell is George MacDonald. And they have a conversation. And in it, as a reflection of Lewis's own conversion, C.S. Lewis wrote about George MacDonald. I know hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continually close to the Spirit of Christ himself. And he published a book of, 1,000 George MacDonald quotes. So if you don't know the story of Lewis's conversion, when he was a young student, he picked up this Fantasies, which is one of his adult fantasies, and in a bookstall. And he attributes that to the beginning of his faith journey. He said it baptized his imagination. And it wasn't until later that he realized that it was goodness that drew him, what ought to be. And but then Lewis goes on and reads all of MacDonald's stuff. He says, I've never written a book in which I did not quote George MacDonald. And many of the themes that you see in Lewis's writing are directly from George MacDonald. Tolkien said similar things. We would never have had The Lord of the Rings or the Narnia Tales or much of G.K. Chesterton's writings if it hadn't been for George MacDonald. That fantasy, myth, was a means of communicating Christian truth and drawing people in where they would not otherwise be heard. So he was very famous in England. Actually, Lewis Carroll brought his book to read to McDonald's kids to see if they liked it. Alice in the Underground, before it was published. Yes. And they said it was good. So he went ahead and published it. So when he came to the States, he was sponsored by James Fields, editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And while he was in the U.S., he had time in people's homes and interacting with Mark Twain, Longfellow, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Emerson, Thackeray, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Wendell Holmes, Bret Hart, John Greenleaf Whittier, William Cullen Bryant, Tennyson, etc. So he was recognized and welcomed as a great writer, author at that time. Yes. So, and he came to Ann Arbor. He gave a lecture at the university. On the tour, he was giving lectures in Boston, New York City, in lots of places, and packed out crowds, standing room only. And one of the guys who was organizing said to McDonald, "Why didn't you tell me you were this good? We could have gotten $800 for a lecture instead of just what we got." But McDonald, he was poor all of his life because he never made much money off what he published. Actually, Michael Phillips, this is a fascinating book. George MacDonald, A Writer's Life. It has the publishing history of every single one of MacDonald's books. Background, who published it, where. Sometimes there were multiple publishers in the US and England at the same time. But it's fascinating. And actually, Michael Phillips has come out with a new Cullen edition of MacDonald's novels. They look a little bit similar to the David Jack ones. However, what Michael Phillips did was to change the Scottish into readable English with a few Scottish words thrown in. Different from David Jack, who's doing the double column thing. But he's reissuing all of MacDonald's books in the Cullen edition, it's called. And this is a history of all of that, yes.
David Phillips?
No, Michael Phillips.
Michael Phillips.
Yes.
So, translating, you've obviously read this.
Yes.
How do you find it compared to the original?
Well, I don't know if I read that yet or not. I think I did. I like the original better, but I love McDonald. Yeah. So reading the original is not a big deal for me. So I don't need it dumbed down, so to speak. Yeah. But this is much more sophisticated, far beyond this. Okay? This is closer to the original. Yeah. But it's Michael Phillips' take on it. Yeah. So a couple of the stories. David Elginbrod. When we were in Huntley, there was a bench outside the Huntley Library with a quote from George MacDonald. Okay, that's the bench that has the quote in it. And let me give it to you exactly. I should find this one easily because it's a... Oh, come on. Get that out of there. I'm obviously not doing the talk as I would have originally. I'm doing it a little more informally. Oh, okay. I will quote it as I remember it. Or probably it's in the beginning of this book. Not wrong one. Here lie I, David Elginbrod. May God have mercy on his soul, on my soul, as would I if I were God and God were David Elginbrod. That was actually a quote on a tombstone that McDonald saw in a graveyard one time, and inspired him. How could we presume that we would be more merciful to someone than God would? One of his quotes from Robert Falconer. I need to read to you. I had too many things to talk about when I put this together. Okay, here it is. This is from Robert Falconer. The little boy. I will remember feeling as a child that I did not care for God to love me if he did not love everybody. The kind of love I needed was the love that all men needed, the love that belonged to their nature as children of the Father, a love that he could not give me except he gave it to all men. This is one of MacDonald's passionate themes. And hell is not about punishment. If people go to hell, it's in order to get rid of the sin, the evil that is in them, until they're sick of it and long for something more. So he didn't deny the existence of hell, but he did not look at it like, sinners in the hands of an angry God. Another thing he challenged always was that you say, oh, the God of the Old Testament and New Testament are different. And Jesus pacified God, so he wasn't quite so angry. He said, that's not true. The Father and Christ were at one in their love for all mankind. Yeah. One of his quotes, he's writing a letter to his father. He says, you will think me presumptuous if I say, leave the epistles and ponder the gospel. The story about Christ. Infinitely, are the epistles mistaken because the gospels are not understood and felt in the heart? The epistles were written for a specific purpose, and the gospels are the central truth. And one of the, he published 3 books of sermons, unspoken sermons. He never did hold up a pulpit again, just one for 2 years when he was just out of seminary. But they got rid of him. They tried to get rid of him by cutting his salary more and more and more, but he wouldn't quit. He managed to keep on, and finally they just persuaded him to leave because of his universalism and to dare to think that animals might go to heaven. And he has a wonderful statement about how anything that was beloved in this world, the child who loved his puppy or his pony, why would we think that would cease to exist in the new world to come? I mean, he had very radical ideas for his time, but things that were such a great comfort to people. Yeah. So, but he was always pondering the Gospels. If he came across something that didn't fit with what he understood Christ to be, he would keep thinking about it. And one of them that we've heard sermons on in this church a few times is the text about crumbs to dogs. The crumbs under the table. And I've heard people in this church say, well, Jesus was really out of line there. He was prejudiced. I'm better than he, because I wasn't that prejudiced. I heard a sermon from one of our resident ministers on that. And, crumbs to dog, well, Jesus hadn't figured it out yet. Well, McDonald wrote a 5-page paper in his Miracles of Our Lord about it, which is absolutely fascinating, about how he came to terms with what Jesus was trying to do there. And the bottom line is that he was trying to get the disciples, as they were about to move into non-Jewish territory, to get them to be considering other people of different cultures and backgrounds, so that they would be ready when they went. So he's challenging them. And the woman had to put up with a little bit, but she ultimately got what she wanted. And through that encounter, Jesus teaches his disciples something. It's a fascinating, I've got it actually, I typed it all out. If you're interested, I can send you a file. But it's that kind of pondering and knowing what in his heart, what God should be like. And when he would talk to people who said they didn't believe in God, he'd ask them, well, what do you think God is like? I wouldn't believe in him either. I mean, it's the way he would bring people into a deeper understanding of what God must be like. David Elginbrod is a little shepherd up in the mountains. Fascinating, wonderful sage. Robert Falconer, this boy who is so put down by his Calvinistic grandmother, winds up being this incredible man who cares for prostitutes in London. Several of the books suggest that Sir Gibby might be a good beginning if you're going to read a George MacDonald novel. I think that's coming out in one of David Jack's volumes, not for in the near future. Fascinating story. But these stories, the plots are wonderful. The Second Sight, the blending of myth and fantasy to communicate deep spiritual truths. It's really, he's an amazing writer.
Do you have anything, Jeanette, on what would you say was the content of his message when he got to speak here and everyone came to see it? What would you say? I think you said you might.
I'll actually give it to you.
I'd love to have it.
Yeah, these are pirated copies. Well, I didn't have the thing I didn't know I could order more to hand out, or I would have. I bought these for $5 a piece. People want the official one, but these we just copied upstairs. Yeah. So you can read it yourself, all right?
Do you have any information about in your thorough reading about him, about the response in Ann Arbor to him? You know, the other preachers. I'm so curious. I wish they were back then.
Well, there's nothing written about it.
There must not be.
Yeah, there isn't. Yeah, but he was some of the. Well, he gave talks at Yale and at Princeton and was well received everywhere he went. But some of the people say, well, he wasn't sophisticated enough or something with his Scottish brogue. But the people who had known his novels, well, he would hold an audience spellbound wherever he went. He was a man who lived what he taught and just drew people to him. His compassion, his care for people, his love, his concern, his meeting everyone where they were. And at one place they actually had to put a guard around him to protect for all the people who were inundating him after one of his talks here in the U.S. He couldn't get off the stage when his son said that he was leaping over the red seats in the auditorium in order to get out because he was exhausted, he was sick, he struggled with bronchitis and tuberculosis while he was here, but he would always make the extra effort to come and to speak. He would never take remuneration for preaching. He didn't call himself a reverend. But he felt that he could communicate the gospel through stories better than through preaching. And he touched more people's lives because of what he wrote than the major ministers of the day who preached on Sunday morning. Yeah. Actually, when he was in the States, a large church on Fifth Avenue in New York City offered him $20,000 a year, which was a fortune at that time, to become their minister. And he turned him down.
I don't think he would have made a very good minister. You know, he's so, well, what do I know? But yeah, I'll stick with that statement. Why do I say that? Because he was so loving and so full of heart that to be a minister, you have to have that administrative part too. You know, that ability to hear both sides and go, here's what we're going to do. I draw the line at this argument now, you know. We're going to move forward. He wouldn't have been able to have held a congregation together.
Well, he did have, several people have mentioned that he could bring people together. He would not be pigeonholed on one side or another. So he could actually bring people together in ways that were remarkable. So it was his not following the Calvinistic rigid theology that got him kicked out of the church. Yeah. 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 So he had 11 kids.
He had 11 children?
11 children. Yeah. He called, in one of his books, he calls Jesus the Bonnie Man. The Bonnie Man. And there's this, one of the characters is mentally challenged, okay? And he goes out onto the moors at night and runs around in the mountains. But he always is looking for the Bonnie Man. The Bonnie Man. Yeah, but, yeah. Okay. We're, in terms of books written about McDonald, I mentioned the Greville biography, which is the original, and his brother wrote Reminiscence. It's a shorter one. Fantasies, that's the adult fantasy. Lilith and Fantasies were the adult fantasies. There have been volumes written about these two books. He published, late in life, Diary of an Old Soul. 365, 6-line poems, prayers for each day of the year. One of my favorites is part of my personal liturgy. My prayers, my God, flow from what I am not. I think thy answers make me what I am. Like weary waves, thought follows upon thought, but the still depth beneath is all thine own. And there thou movest in paths to us unknown. Out of strange strife, thy peace is strangely wrought. If the lion in us prays, thou answerest the lamb. Yeah, the heart of George MacDonald. So, Roland Ryan wrote several books, The Harmony Within. I actually discovered one on my shelf that I bought and haven't read yet. It was published in 1976, before this MacDonald awakening came. Victorian Mythmaker, I think of all the biographies I've read, I like that the best. C.S. Lewis called him master. 3,000 quotations of the writing of George MacDonald. A new one, Waking the Dead, that deals more with his mysticism. Yes. And that's only a portion of what I brought. In 2020, I was signed up to attend a George MacDonald conference in Cullen, Michigan, which is the setting for The Fisherman's Lady, or Malcolm. Scotland. What did I say? Scotland. In Scotland. And we went to Cullen. Actually attended a church there that McDonald had been in, but McDonald spent a long time in this fishing village, and the characters in this book and the drawing of that area are just fascinating. So we took some pictures. There's a panorama. Let me see if I can get to it. Yeah, a little fishing village. Yeah. So I was going to attend that, but of course with COVID it got canceled. So I'm hoping sometime. But there are many, many people all over the world. The George MacDonald Facebook page just people writing from all over the world, and quotes after quotes after quotes.
Has anyone here read one of McDonald's historic books? I know,
Pam has, yeah.
And it
Yeah.
sounds like Pam's,
Yeah,
yeah, I have not, I can't imagine, I'll have to read the Fisherman's Village.
Fisherman's Ladies.
Fisherman's Lady.
Yeah, that's.
Actually,
the first one.
I found in my going through stuff today that I have 2 copies of a book. Where did I put it? This is The Minister's Restoration. This is one of the abridged ones. It was originally published as,
Is that a novel? Or?
it's a novel. Yeah. Salted with Fire, maybe. It's one of his later ones. Yeah, originally titled Salted with Fire.
Okay.
And it's a story about a minister who, temptation and trial, speak of a problem as contemporary as today's newspapers. Sin in the lives of those in public ministry. So if you want to take this to start, it wouldn't be necessarily the first one that I would urge you to start with, but it's a good one.
It's always fun to read the first work and then a later work.
Now, the Fisherman's Lady is Malcolm, right?
Yes, Malcolm.
So that's
Yeah.
interesting. If you're looking and you can't find the Fisherman's Lady, because it's like the first, it's also called Malcolm.
It's also called Malcolm.
Malcolm,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
that was a very, by Philip.
Malcolm is the original title.
Original title.
Yes,
Yeah. Look
yes.
forward to it. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, so the George McDonald and his wife, original biography by Greville McDonald. The foreword was written by G.K. Chesterton, and it's a fascinating little piece. Victorian Mythmaker, foreword was written by Frederick Buechner. There's a whole group of people, some of these are from Wheaton College or Wheaton University, but Yale University has the archives of George McDonald's, lots of stuff. So there's so much available about him, and there's a renaissance of him, of interest in him after many years of just kind of not being around, I guess. Yeah. He wrote novels, plays, essays, sermons, poems, fairy tales. We didn't talk about the fairy tales, which is Pam's favorite, and fantasies. Wonderful fairy tales for children. And the At the Back of the North Wind, which is dealing with a young child facing death. And the Back of the North Wind, there's some very terrifying moments in it. But to know the sovereign hand of God, even in all of that, and to be safe at the back of the north wind. Mark, I don't know if you were here when I mentioned Mark Twain loved that book and his children loved it. His daughter read it over and over again. Yeah, at the back of the north wind. But his fairy tales are wonderful as well. G.K. Chesterton said when he read The Princess and the Goblin, it changed his life.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
It's sitting on my dining room table. I carried it for years and years.
yeah. So this is a writer who has impacted so many people. I was surprised to see Morris Sendak's quote. His main forte was fantasy, Sendak explains. For admirers of McDonald, such as myself, his work has something of the effect of a hallucinatory drug. Finishing one of his stories is often like waking from a dream, one's own dream.
So what they have in common is there's kindness behind it. It's not, you don't have the
It's-
antagonistic type of.
Yeah, they can be scary, but you know it's going to be all right. And it isn't this Dickens kind of, everything turns out in the end and everybody gets rich.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's death. Sometimes things don't end in the way you expect. One of my favorites is Alec Forbes of Howland. It's a book about orphan Annie, a little Annie who's an orphan. And Robert Bruce is her uncle who takes her in after his father dies, and he is the most villainous creature. In favor of Dickens, you get the mean schoolmaster. And actually, in Alec Forbes, the schoolmaster really is mean, and he would beat the children and beat them. And little Annie was terrified for her life, and Alec takes her under his wing to protect her and take some abuse that she would get. But the schoolmaster beats this one kid until he's lame for life. And the redemption of that schoolmaster through that child is one of the stories that is just so moving in that book. Oh, one of the other quotes, weather is one of the main characters in McDonald's novels. Weather is an actual character. Storms and floods, and many of his main characters love to go out on the ocean shore in a gale, in a brisk wind, and just face the elements.
Wow, that sounds like the ancient scribes and the writers of the
Yeah.
New Testament.
Yeah. But there's so much in McDonald. And I showed this to Pam and Mary, but this is one of the quotes I have posted on my by my desk. Yes, sure.